In a lot of ways, the original Devil May Cry plays like a simplified Resident Evil game that has magic and demons in place of viruses and zombies. It feels more like a classic survival horror than a completely nutty action game, and I don't mean for that to sound like a bad thing. After all, it literally created a genre, so you can't expect it to be as bombastic and nutty as some of the most recent games in the series. It really is incredible just how much they managed to get right with this first entry. It doesn't feel like a failed Resident Evil 4 prototype. It feels like its own game with a unique vision of what combining action and gothic horror could look like. I think that one thing this game absolutely got right is the atmosphere. They nailed the feeling of going through a mysterious castle. You can find all sorts of paintings on the walls in the early corridors, and there's this creepy ambient track that loops in non-combat zones which has flourishes of a symphony, creating the feeling that there's something else inside the castle with you. This may seem strange since Dante's combat music is industrial metal and he cracks one-liners like it's nobody's business.
Are you the human, the son of Sparda who challenges the darkness for this?
Block off, Featherface, or you can stick around and find out the hard way.
But the two sides of being both a stylish action game and a creepy castle game never really clashed for me, which is incredible. I'll be honest and say that I love this first Devil May Cry game, but it's not actually my #1 favorite in the series. But with that being said, I don't think any of its sequels are as good at creating an atmosphere as this one. Not all of the game takes place in a castle. Some of it takes place in a pirate ghost boat, which is kind of hilarious now that I think about it. And I know that sounds really dumb, but like the castle, the boat is creepy and contributes to the atmosphere with its rooms of abandoned luxury and just weird faces on the walls. Towards the end of the game, you enter the underworld, which is depicted as this fleshy, writhing mass. It feels alive and it feels disgusting. In fact, now that I think about it, that might be a holdover from when it was a Resident Evil game, since everything being gross and organic is pretty common in those games. But this fleshy aesthetic extends over to the design of a weapon, Sparda, which I think is one of the coolest looking swords ever, because it doesn't look like a sword, it looks like a talon from a horrible monster. And speaking of monsters, the demon designs in this are great. I love the design for Griffin, which is a giant bird type demon. He has several faces and beaks around his head. The shadows, which are these giant cat type enemies, are really cool too because they can morph and mold their bodies into different things, such as blades to attack you. Nightmare, which is a giant blob monster, is actually pretty cool because it morphs as you attack it and it can send out little gun type things to shoot at you as you attempt to beat its weak point. It's an interesting design. To be honest though, I don't care all that much for the marionettes you face throughout the game because I don't find puppets to be all that scary or interesting, but most of the enemy designs in this are pretty dope. One thing I find really interesting about this game is the characterization of the protagonist, Dante. In later games, he's characterized as being way more wild and over the top, whereas in this game, even though he mocks pretty much all the bosses and you even have a taunt button in the game, he's still serious a lot of the time. I actually like this characterization of Dante not being completely wacky all the time and, dare I say it, somewhat mature. Like I mentioned in passing earlier, Devil May Cry started off as a Resident Evil 4 prototype before becoming its own thing, and so I think Dante is written the way he is because of the protagonist of RE4, Leon. If you compare the two, they're both action heroes that crack one-liners in serious situations while still being able to be serious themselves when they need to be. They're definitely not the same considering that Dante is half demon and has a lot of family stuff to deal with, but I think it's fair to say that they have more than a passing similarity. Regardless of what you think about the comparison, I think this Dante is definitely much tamer than the interpretation of the character found in DMC 3 and 4, and I think you could say that about much of this game, that it's tamer than later entries in the series. And that's not bad, it's just different. And it feels like I can't overemphasize this enough, that if you play through it for the first time, you can't expect it to play like later games. You have to take it on its own terms, and I think you'll find it very enjoyable. Now, with that being said, I really like this game and I enjoy it a lot, but I don't love everything about it. For instance, I think the third fight with Nightmare is awful because of the camera angles, which aren't always helpful. Also, as is to be expected for a game that came out around this time period, some of the voice acting is pretty awful but hilarious, as evidenced by the most infamous line in the series.
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
I also think that some of the later non-hack and slash sections, such as the Bullet Hell Mundus fight towards the end, are outright awful. It's like you're playing one game and all of a sudden it switches to another, but honestly the good of this game far outweighs the bad. Most of the problems with this game just stem from it being over 20 years old, and again, this game created the hack and slash genre, or character action games, or whatever you want to call them. Without this, there'd be no Bayonetta, or God Hand, or Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, or Ultra Kill. Dozens of other games would simply not exist without this one. It's easy to look at the game now and to point out its flaws, flaws, but given the strides made in the genre over the past 2 decades and looking at how insane things have gotten, I just don't think that's fair. I love this game because not only is it the first of a genre I adore, but because it's just a solid game. It's fun, and that's what it boils down to. By the way, it's a short game also. My most recent playthrough took me about 4 or 5 hours on the normal difficulty. A short length for a video game isn't always a good thing, but I think it works here because it doesn't overstay its welcome, and as soon as you beat it, you want to go through it again. It's extremely replayable. So to close this out, I think DMC1 has some flaws, but even still, 20 plus years later, it's a game with a unique and realized vision of stylish action and gothic horror, and I think that it's distinct enough that even if you prefer a later entry in the series, like I do, that it's still worth coming back to this one from time to time. Thanks for watching.